The day my daughter Jessica told me I was becoming too needy and suggested I transfer my assets to someone more grateful was the day I realized my own child saw me as nothing more than a burden to be managed. For 45 years, I had built a successful interior design empire, raised 3 children as a single mother, and accumulated a portfolio worth over $12 million. And how did my family repay me? By treating me like an inconvenient elderly relative whose only value lay in what I could give them. What they didn't know was that behind my quiet, accommodating exterior lay secrets that would shatter their comfortable assumptions about who held the real power in our family. Secrets that would turn their world upside down in ways they never saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I never imagined that at 68, I'd be sitting in my penthouse apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, questioning whether the people I loved most in the world actually cared about me at all. My name is Margaret Blackwood, though everyone calls me Maggie, and for the past 4 decades, I've been one of Chicago's most sought-after interior designers. My firm, Blackwood Interiors, has transformed everything from historic mansions to luxury hotels across the Midwest. But none of that seemed to matter to my children when they gathered in my living room that crisp October evening to deliver what they called an intervention. Jessica, my eldest at 42, had always been the most direct of my 3 children. She inherited my business acumen, but none of my patience for subtlety. Sitting rigidly on the cream velvet sofa I'd selected, specifically for its warmth and comfort, she looked more like she was conducting a hostile corporate takeover than having a family conversation. "Mom, we need to talk about your increasing dependency," she began, her voice taking on the tone she used with her own teenage children when they'd misbehaved. The constant phone calls, the requests for us to visit more often, the way you cling to us during family gatherings. It's becoming unhealthy. My middle child, Robert, nodded in agreement from his position near the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the Chicago skyline. At 39, he'd followed his father into finance before my ex-husband's death 5 years earlier. Robert had inherited his father's calculating nature and apparent ability to view relationships through a purely transactional lens. "We're concerned about your mental state," he added, consulting notes on his phone as if this were a business meeting. "Living alone in this huge apartment, calling us multiple times a day, expecting us to rearrange our schedules around your social needs. It's not sustainable." Only my youngest, David, seemed uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. At 36, he'd always been the most empathetic of my children, perhaps because he'd struggled with addiction in his 20s and understood what it meant to feel isolated and misunderstood. But even he remained silent as his siblings built their case against me. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked, though something in their coordinated presentation told me I already knew the answer. Jessica exchanged a glance with Robert before continuing. "We think it would be best if you moved into a senior living community, somewhere with built-in social activities and support systems. You'd have peers your own age, professional staff to help with your needs, and we wouldn't have to worry about you being alone." The words hit me like a physical blow. After everything I'd accomplished, after building a business that employed 37 people, after raising 3 children largely on my own following my divorce 20 years ago, they were suggesting I needed to be managed like an invalid. "I'm 68, not 98, I said, trying to keep my voice level. "I run a successful business. I'm in excellent health. I live independently and have for decades." "But for how long?" Robert interjected. "You're already showing signs of increased neediness. What happens when your health declines? When your cognitive abilities start to fade? We can't be expected to drop everything to care for you." Expected to drop everything. The phrase echoed in my mind as I looked at these 3 people I'd sacrificed so much for. When Jessica needed money for her MBA, I'd liquidated investments to pay her tuition. When Robert's startup had failed spectacularly, I'd quietly covered his mortgage payments for 8 months to prevent foreclosure. When David had needed rehab, I'd not only paid for the best facility in the country, but had attended family therapy sessions twice a week for a year. But they couldn't be expected to drop everything for me. "There's something else," Jessica continued, her voice taking on what I recognized as her closing argument tone. "We've been thinking about your assets, your estate planning. If you're going to need increasing levels of care, it might make sense to start transferring some of your wealth now. For tax purposes, of course." Of course, everything always came back to money with Jessica. "We've identified some worthy recipients," she said, producing a folder I hadn't noticed before. "Robert's children will need college funding soon. David could use help getting his consulting business off the ground. And I've been looking at expanding my marketing firm." I stared at the folder, understanding finally crystallizing like ice in my veins. This wasn't an intervention about my mental health or my social needs. This was a carefully orchestrated attempt to convince me I was incompetent so they could access my wealth while I was still alive to sign the papers. "You want me to transfer my assets to you because you think I'm becoming too needy?" I said slowly, each word deliberate. "To people who would be more grateful," Jessica corrected, "who wouldn't take your generosity for granted." The irony was breathtaking. My own children, who had taken my generosity for granted their entire lives, were lecturing me about gratitude while simultaneously trying to convince me I was mentally declining so they could inherit early. "I need time to think about this," I said, standing up from my chair. The movement was swift and decisive, the opposite of the frail, dependent woman they were trying to paint me as. "Of course," Robert said, his tone suggesting he thought the conversation had gone exactly as planned. "But don't take too long, Mom. These kinds of decisions are better made sooner rather than later." After they left, I stood at my windows, looking out at the lake, the city lights reflecting off the dark water like scattered diamonds. The apartment felt enormous around me, not because I was lonely, but because I was finally seeing clearly how alone I'd been for years. They thought I was needy because I called them regularly. They thought I was clingy because I wanted to spend time with my family. They thought I was declining because I lived by myself in a home I'd chosen and loved. What they didn't understand was that Margaret Blackwood, the dependent mother they were so eager to manage, was only one facet of who I was. They had no idea about the other aspects of my life, the ones I'd kept private not out of secrecy, but out of modesty. They didn't know about the investment portfolio I'd built independently of my design business, one that had been quietly outperforming the market for over 2 decades. They didn't know about the real estate holdings I'd accumulated across 3 states, properties I'd bought, renovated, and rented under a corporate name they'd never heard of. They didn't know about the technology patents I owned, innovations in smart home systems that I'd developed and licensed to major manufacturers. Most importantly, they didn't know about the charitable foundation I'd been running anonymously for 15 years, one that had donated over $8 million to causes supporting single mothers and female entrepreneurs. My children saw me as an aging woman whose only value lay in the assets they hoped to inherit. What they were about to discover was that the woman they were trying to manipulate had been playing a much more sophisticated game than they ever imagined. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next morning, I canceled my usual Tuesday coffee date with my neighbor, and instead called my attorney, Patricia Morrison. Patricia had been my legal counsel for over 20 years, handling everything from business contracts to my divorce settlement. More importantly, she was one of the few people who knew the full extent of my holdings and activities. "Maggie," she greeted me warmly when I arrived at her downtown office. "It's been too long. How can I help you?" I explained the previous evening's conversation, watching Patricia's expression grow increasingly grim as I detailed my children's suggestions about my mental state and their proposals for asset transfers. "This is elder financial abuse," Patricia said bluntly when I finished. "Textbook manipulation designed to make you doubt your own competence while positioning themselves to benefit financially." "I know," I replied. "The question is, what can I do about it?" Patricia leaned back in her chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Well, that depends. How much are you willing to let them discover about who you really are?" For 40 years, I'd been careful to keep my various business interests separate from my identity as Jessica, Robert, and David's mother. I'd never wanted my children to feel overshadowed by my success or to question whether I loved them for themselves rather than their achievements. I'd downplayed my accomplishments, minimized my wealth, and always made their needs and feelings the priority. But their attempt to declare me incompetent while grabbing for my assets had changed something fundamental in our relationship. If they wanted to treat me like a commodity to be managed, perhaps it was time they learned exactly what commodity they were dealing with. "I want them to understand who they're really trying to manipulate," I told Patricia. "All of it." Patricia's smile widened. "In that case, I have some ideas." Over the next week, I went about my normal routine while Patricia quietly began implementing what we privately called Operation Reality Check. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Since my children had positioned themselves as concerned about my mental competence and my financial security, we would give them a front-row seat to exactly how competent and secure I actually was. The first phase involved my business. While Blackwood Interiors was successful and well-known in Chicago, I'd always been modest about its scope and profitability. My children knew I was comfortable, but had no idea that the firm had grown into a multi-million-dollar enterprise with clients across the country. I arranged for Chicago Business Weekly to do a feature article on Blackwood Interiors as one of the city's most successful woman-owned businesses. The piece would include details about our recent expansion into sustainable design, our corporate partnerships with major hotel chains, and our upcoming projects in New York and Los Angeles. The second phase involved my real estate holdings. Patricia began the process of consolidating my properties under my own name, rather than the various corporate entities I'd used for privacy. This would create a public record of ownership that anyone conducting a basic search would discover. The third phase was the most delicate. We decided to accidentally reveal my involvement with several high-profile charitable initiatives, including my anonymous foundation. This would happen through a planned leak to a society columnist who specialized in philanthropy coverage. But the masterpiece of our plan involved something my children had no idea existed: my technology patents. Over the past decade, I'd been quietly developing smart home integration systems inspired by my work designing modern living spaces. What had started as a hobby had evolved into a series of innovations that were now licensed to 3 major technology companies. Patricia arranged for one of these companies to publicly announce their newest smart home system, including prominent credit to Margaret Blackwood, innovative designer and technology developer. The announcement would coincide with the revelation that the patents were being sold for $38 million. "Are you sure about this?" Patricia asked as we finalized the timing. "Once this information becomes public, there's no going back to being just their needy mother." I thought about Jessica's condescending tone, Robert's calculated dismissal of my autonomy, and David's silent complicity in their scheme. I thought about 45 years of building a life and career they'd never bothered to truly understand. "I'm sure," I said. "It's time they learned who they're really dealing with." The Chicago Business Weekly article appeared on a Thursday morning. By noon, I'd received congratulatory calls from clients, colleagues, and friends who'd had no idea about the full scope of my business success. The article painted a picture of a design mogul who'd built an empire while maintaining an almost secretive level of privacy about her achievements. I didn't hear from any of my children that day. Friday brought the Society column piece about anonymous philanthropists in Chicago. The columnist had done excellent work, revealing that a prominent local businesswoman had been the secret force behind several major charitable initiatives, including full college scholarships for dozens of single mothers and funding for 3 women's business incubators. Still no calls from Jessica, Robert, or David. Monday delivered the technology announcement that made national news. The smart home system patent sale was covered by tech blogs, business journals, and even made a brief mention on the morning financial news shows. Suddenly, Margaret Blackwood wasn't just a successful interior designer. She was an innovator whose work was being implemented in homes across the country. My phone started ringing Tuesday morning. "Mom?" Jessica's voice was tight with something I couldn't quite identify. "I just saw an article about you in Forbes, about some technology patents." "Oh, that," I said casually, settling into my favorite reading chair with my morning coffee. "Yes, I've been working on some smart home integration systems. Nothing too complicated." "Nothing too complicated." Jessica's voice rose an octave. "The article says you sold the patents for almost $40 million. $38.6 million to be precise," I confirmed. "Though that's before taxes and licensing fees, of course." Silence stretched across the phone line. I could practically hear Jessica's mind racing, trying to reconcile this information with their previous week's assessment of me as a declining woman who needed to transfer her assets. "Mom, why didn't you tell us about any of this?" she finally asked. "Tell you about what?" I replied innocently. "My work? My business activities? I mention them all the time, sweetheart. You've just never seemed particularly interested." This was true, though perhaps not entirely fair. I had mentioned my various projects over the years, but always in passing, never emphasizing their scope or profitability. When I'd talked about working on some home automation ideas, they'd apparently pictured me tinkering with light switches, not developing revolutionary integration systems. "But the article says you've been doing this for years," Jessica pressed. "That you have multiple patents, multiple income streams, real estate holdings." "Well, yes," I agreed. "I've always believed in diversification. Surely Robert explained that to you at some point. It's basic financial planning." I heard what sounded like Jessica putting her hand over the phone, muffled conversation in the background. When she returned, her voice had taken on the carefully controlled tone she used when she was trying not to lose her temper. "Mom, we need to talk. All of us. Can you come over for dinner tonight?" "I'm afraid I can't," I said, checking my calendar. "I have a consultation with a potential client in Evanston. Tomorrow's no good either. I'm flying to New York to look at a hotel project. How about next week?" More muffled conversation. "Mom, this is important. Can't you reschedule?" I smiled, remembering how readily they'd expected me to rearrange my schedule for their intervention. "I'm sorry, darling, but my business commitments take priority. You understand how that is, I'm sure." We settled on dinner the following Tuesday, giving me another week to let the full implications of my revealed success sink in. Patricia was delighted with their obvious shock and scrambling. "They're doing exactly what we expected," she reported after running into Robert at a downtown restaurant. He spent the entire meal on his phone, apparently trying to verify the information in the articles. His dinner companion looked ready to throw her wine at him. The next few days brought a steady stream of revelations as my children and their friends began researching their mother's actual accomplishments. The real estate holdings became public record when the consolidation was completed. A casual mention in a design magazine revealed that I'd been quietly consulted on several high-profile residential projects for celebrities and business leaders. Most shocking of all, the revelation about my charitable foundation emerged when a grateful scholarship recipient mentioned the anonymous benefactor who changed my life in a local news interview, providing enough details for enterprising reporters to trace the funding back to me. By the time Tuesday evening arrived, I suspected my children had a very different understanding of who their needy mother actually was. I arrived at Jessica's suburban home precisely on time, carrying a bottle of wine and a small gift for my granddaughter. The house was one I'd helped design 8 years earlier, though Jessica had never acknowledged my contribution when friends complimented the space. All 3 of my children were waiting in the living room, their expressions ranging from bewildered to calculating. David looked the most uncomfortable, fidgeting with his phone and avoiding eye contact. Robert wore his poker face, the one he'd inherited from his father, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. Jessica appeared to be barely containing herself, vibrating with questions, and what I suspected was barely suppressed anger. "Hello, darlings," I said cheerfully, settling onto the same sofa where they'd delivered their intervention the week before. "Thank you for having me over. How has everyone been?" "Cut the act, Mom," Jessica said immediately. "We know." "No? What, sweetheart?" "About the patents, the foundation, the real estate, all of it," Robert interjected. "We've spent the last week finding out that our mother is apparently some kind of secret business mogul." I tilted my head as if confused. "Secret? I've never made any of my activities secret. I simply didn't think you were particularly interested in the details of my work." "Not interested?" Jessica's voice was climbing toward the same pitch she'd used as a teenager when caught lying about her whereabouts. "Mom, you let us think you were just a decorator." "Interior designer," I corrected gently. "And I've always been quite proud of my work, but you're right that it's only one aspect of what I do." David finally spoke up, his voice quieter than his siblings. "Mom, the articles say you've donated over $8 million to charity. In secret." "Not secret," I repeated. "Anonymous. There's a difference. I believe in supporting causes that matter to me, but I've never seen the need for public recognition." This was the moment I'd been building toward. They were finally seeing me not as their declining mother, but as a successful, autonomous woman who'd been making significant impacts in multiple areas while they'd been dismissing her as needy and dependent. "Why didn't you tell us?" Jessica demanded. "About any of it?" I considered my answer carefully. "When would I have told you? During the phone calls you complained were too frequent. During the family visits you said were evidence of my unhealthy dependency. Or perhaps during last week's intervention when you explained that I was becoming incompetent and should transfer my assets to people who would be more grateful." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as the full implications of their behavior sank in. They had attempted to manipulate a woman they believed was vulnerable and declining, only to discover that she was actually more successful and financially secure than they'd ever imagined. "Look," Robert finally said, shifting into damage control mode. "We were concerned about you. The phone calls, wanting to spend more time together. It seemed like you were becoming overly dependent on us." "Overly dependent," I repeated. "I called you each twice a week to check in and share news about my life. I invited you to family dinners once a month. I attended my grandchildren's school events and birthday parties. This constituted concerning dependency?" When they couldn't answer, I continued. "Or was it perhaps that having a mother who wanted to maintain close relationships with her adult children was inconvenient for your busy lives?" Jessica had recovered enough to attempt a counterattack. "You should have told us about your financial situation. We had no idea you were so substantial." "And why would my financial situation be your business?" I asked. "I'm a competent adult managing my own affairs. When did my children decide they needed to monitor and approve of my financial decisions?" This was the crux of the matter, and we all knew it. They'd seen me as an aging woman whose primary value lay in what she might leave them when she died. The discovery that I was not only financially secure but actively building wealth had fundamentally altered their perception of our relationship. "What happens now?" David asked, and I heard something in his voice that might have been shame. "Now," I said, standing up and smoothing my skirt, "you all think very carefully about what kind of relationship you actually want with me. Because I'm not going anywhere, I'm not declining, and I'm certainly not transferring my assets to anyone based on their level of gratitude." I paused at the door, looking back at my 3 children. "I love you all deeply, but I will not be managed, manipulated, or treated as incompetent by anyone, including my own family. When you're ready to have an honest conversation about our relationship, one based on respect rather than assumptions about my diminished capacity, call me." "But Mom," Jessica started. "The number is the same as always," I said, "though perhaps you'll think twice before dismissing my calls as evidence of neediness." I walked out into the cool Chicago evening, leaving them to contemplate the wreckage of their carefully planned intervention. They'd tried to convince me I was too needy, too dependent, too declining to manage my own life. Instead, they'd discovered that the woman they'd been so eager to control had been living a far more impressive and impactful life than they'd ever imagined. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to prove I needed them, they'd revealed exactly how little they actually knew about who I was. But this was only the beginning. Patricia and I had prepared for multiple scenarios, and my children's reaction told me we were going to need all of them. Because Margaret Blackwood, the woman they'd dismissed as a needy burden, was just getting started. The week following my dinner with the children passed in a strange mix of vindication and melancholy. Phone calls that had once come regularly dwindled to nothing. Jessica, Robert, and David were clearly regrouping, trying to figure out how to approach a mother who had suddenly revealed herself to be far more formidable than they'd assumed. Patricia called Wednesday morning with an update that made me smile despite my complicated feelings about the situation. "Your son Robert was seen at the Chicago Athletic Association yesterday, having what looked like a very intense conversation with James Kellerman," she reported. "Kellerman specializes in high-net-worth estate planning. I suspect Robert is trying to get a professional assessment of your actual financial position." I wasn't surprised. Robert had always been the most calculating of my children, the one most likely to approach a problem methodically. If he was consulting estate attorneys, it meant he was trying to understand exactly how much money was at stake and what his previous behavior might have cost him. "Let him investigate," I told Patricia. "He'll find that everything is properly documented and legally sound. He'll also discover that there's significantly more than even the recent articles revealed." This was true. The technology patents and charitable foundation were impressive, but they represented only a portion of my holdings. Over the past 20 years, I'd quietly built a portfolio that included everything from commercial real estate to startup investments, to a collection of art that had appreciated beyond my wildest expectations. My children's attempt to declare me incompetent and grab my assets had failed spectacularly, but I suspected they weren't done trying to figure out how to benefit from their newfound knowledge of my wealth. The next revelation came from an unexpected source. David called Thursday evening, his voice tentative in a way that reminded me of when he was a little boy who'd broken something and wasn't sure whether to confess. "Mom, I need to apologize," he began, "not just for last week, but for a lot of things." "I'm listening," I said, settling into my reading chair with a cup of tea. "I've been in therapy since my divorce," he continued, "working on understanding patterns, you know. And this week, my therapist helped me see something about how we've been treating you." I waited, giving him space to work through whatever he was trying to say. "We've been seeing you through this weird lens where you're either our successful independent mother or you're this lonely woman who needs us to take care of her. But you're both, aren't you? You can be incredibly accomplished and still want relationships with your children." His insight was more perceptive than I'd expected. David had always been the most emotionally intelligent of my children, perhaps because his struggles with addiction had forced him to develop a deeper understanding of human complexity. "Yes," I said simply. I can be both. Jessica and Robert. They're freaking out because they realize how wrong they were about your financial situation. But I'm freaking out because I realize how wrong I was about your emotional situation. What do you mean? David was quiet for a moment. You weren't being needy when you called us. You were being normal. You were trying to maintain relationships with your adult children, and we made you feel like that was pathological. The acknowledgement hit me harder than I'd expected. Of all the betrayals from the previous week, perhaps the most painful had been the suggestion that my desire for connection with my family was evidence of mental decline. I love you all very much, I said. I always have. But I won't apologize for wanting to be part of your lives. You shouldn't have to, David replied. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. When you were building all of this, the business, empire, and the patents and everything, why didn't you ever talk about it? Not to brag, but just to share what was going on in your life? It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself since the previous week's confrontation. I suppose I was trying to protect you all from feeling overshadowed. Your father always had a fragile ego about success, especially mine. After the divorce, I got into the habit of downplaying my accomplishments so you wouldn't feel pressure to compete or worry that I loved you less if you achieved less. But that backfired, didn't it? David observed. Because we ended up thinking you were less than you are. It appears so. We talked for another hour, the longest conversation David and I had shared in years. He told me about his consulting business, which was struggling, more than he'd admitted to his siblings. He talked about his divorce and his fears about being a good father to his 2 young daughters. He asked about my work, my travels, my plans for the future. For the first time since the intervention, I felt like I was talking to one of my children rather than someone who saw me as a problem to be solved. What happens now? He asked as our conversation wound down. That depends on what you want to happen, I replied. But David, I need you to understand something. I won't go back to pretending to be less than I am to make other people comfortable. That includes your siblings. I wouldn't want you to, he said. I'm proud of you, Mom. I should have said that years ago. After we hung up, I found myself cautiously optimistic that at least one of my relationships might be salvageable. David's willingness to examine his own behavior and acknowledge his mistakes suggested a maturity that had been absent from our family dynamics for too long. Jessica and Robert, however, remained silent. Friday brought an unexpected development. My assistant Caroline called to inform me that someone had been asking questions about Blackwood interiors at our office building. It was a woman, professionally, dressed, asking the security guard about our client list and recent projects, Caroline reported. When I came down to see what was happening, she introduced herself as conducting research for a potential investor. Did she give a name? Sandra Mitchell. But when I offered to set up a formal meeting, she said she'd be in touch and left quickly. I didn't recognize the name, but something about the situation felt off. Legitimate investors didn't conduct reconnaissance missions through building security guards. They made appointments, submitted formal proposals, worked through proper channels. I asked Caroline to review our security footage and have our building management tighten access protocols. If someone was investigating my business under false pretenses, I wanted to know who and why. The answer came sooner than expected. Patricia called Saturday morning with information that made my blood run cold. I know who Sandra Mitchell is, she said without preamble. She's a private investigator who specializes in asset searches and competency evaluations for families concerned about elderly relatives. The implications hit me immediately. My children, or at least one of them, had hired a private investigator to dig into my business and potentially build a case for declaring me incompetent. How certain are you? I asked. Very. I have a friend who's used her services before, though for legitimate purposes. Sandra Mitchell's specialty is finding. hidden assets, and documenting behavior that might support guardianship proceedings. They were still trying to have me declared incompetent, even after discovering the extent of my success. The revelation that I was worth significantly more than they'd imagined hadn't deterred them. It had apparently made them more determined to find a way to control my assets. "What's our next move?" I asked Patricia. "We document everything: security footage, witness statements, any evidence of her investigation. If they're building a case for incompetency, we need to be prepared to defend against it." The rest of the weekend passed in a blur of phone calls and preparations. Patricia connected me with a specialist in elder law who explained the process by which adult children could petition for guardianship of a parent. The standards were high, requiring clear evidence of cognitive decline or inability to manage one's affairs, but determined families with good attorneys sometimes succeeded in marginalizing competent older adults. "The fact that you've been so private about your success actually works against you," the specialist explained. "They could argue that your secretiveness about your finances demonstrates confusion or paranoia." It was maddening. My modest discretion about my accomplishments, something I'd considered a virtue, was being weaponized against me by my own children. Monday morning brought the next phase of their campaign. Caroline called to report that someone from Chicago Business Verification Services had contacted our major clients, claiming to be updating our business profile for a directory listing. "They're asking detailed questions about your involvement in projects, your decision-making capacity, whether you've seemed confused or forgetful during meetings," Caroline said. Mrs. Harrison from the Lakefront Hotel project called to ask if everything was okay. I felt a surge of anger that surprised me with its intensity. They weren't just investigating my finances anymore. They were actively trying to damage my professional reputation by planting seeds of doubt about my mental capacity. "Caroline, I need you to call every client we've worked with in the past 2 years. Let them know that someone is conducting an unauthorized investigation into our firm and that any such inquiries should be directed to our legal counsel. Should I mention that it might be family-related?" I hesitated. Admitting that my own children were trying to sabotage my business felt like a humiliation I wasn't ready to face. But the alternative was letting the investigation continue unchallenged. "Yes," I said finally. "If anyone asks directly, you can explain that there's a family dispute involving questions about estate planning, and that certain parties are unfortunately targeting the business as part of their strategy." The next few days revealed the full scope of their investigation. The private investigator had contacted my doctor's office, my bank, even my housekeeper, Maria, claiming to be conducting a wellness check on behalf of concerned family members. Maria called me directly, clearly upset by the encounter. "Mrs. Blackwood, a woman came to my house yesterday asking questions about you," she said in her accented English. "She wanted to know if you ever seemed confused, if you forgot things, if I had to help you with basic tasks. I told her you are the sharpest person I know, but she kept pushing." Maria had worked for me for 12 years, maintaining my apartment and occasionally helping with dinner parties. She knew better than anyone how competently I managed my daily life. "What did you tell her?" "I told her to go away," Maria said, firmly. "I told her you don't need anyone to check on you, that you take care of yourself better than people half your age." "But Mrs. Blackwood, why would your family hire someone to ask such questions?" The hurt in her voice mirrored my own feelings. Maria had watched my children grow up, had prepared countless family dinners, had seen firsthand how devoted I'd been as a mother. The idea that those same children were now trying to portray me as incompetent was as painful for her as it was for me. "Because they're more interested in my money than my well-being," I said, the words bitter in my mouth. By Thursday, the pattern was clear. Jessica and Robert, unable to argue that I was financially struggling or professionally declining, were building a case based on social isolation and potential cognitive issues. They were systematically contacting everyone in my life, looking for evidence that I was confused, paranoid, or unable to manage my affairs. The irony was staggering. In trying to prove I was mentally incompetent, they were demonstrating a level of calculation and cruelty that called their own judgment into question. Friday evening brought the confrontation I'd been expecting. Jessica called, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "Mom, we need to talk. There are some concerns that have been raised about your recent behavior." "Concerns raised by whom?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "By people who care about your well-being. Your doctor's office mentioned that you've been calling frequently with questions about minor health issues. Your bank noted some unusual account activity. Even Maria mentioned that you've been asking her to repeat instructions. Each claim was a distortion of normal interactions, twisted to suggest incompetence. I had called my doctor's office twice in the past month with questions about medication interactions, standard protocol for someone taking multiple prescriptions. The unusual account activity was likely my recent real estate transactions and investment moves, all perfectly legal and profitable. And Maria had never mentioned anything about repeated instructions because it had never happened." "I see," I said calmly. "And based on these concerns, what are you proposing?" "We think it would be appropriate to have a comprehensive evaluation done, cognitive testing, financial assessment, maybe a consultation with a geriatric specialist, to determine my competency?" "To determine what level of support you might need," Jessica corrected, but the euphemism fooled neither of us. "And if I refuse?" The pause was telling. "Mom, we hope it won't come to that. But we have a responsibility to protect you, even if you can't see that you need protection." There it was. The threat wrapped in concern, the ultimatum disguised as family intervention. Submit to their evaluation and risk being declared incompetent, or face the possibility of forced guardianship proceedings. "I'll consider your suggestion," I said evenly. "In the meantime, I expect all investigations into my personal and professional life to cease immediately." "What investigations?" Jessica asked, but her tone suggested she knew exactly what I meant. "The private investigator you hired to harass my employees, clients, and household staff. The fake business verification calls, the wellness checks with my medical providers. All of it stops now." "Mom, I think you're being paranoid. No one is investigating you." "Jessica," I said, my voice carrying a warning that I hoped she was smart enough to heed. "I am not paranoid, confused, or incompetent. I am a successful businesswoman with significant resources and excellent legal counsel. If you continue this campaign to undermine my reputation and question my competency, you will discover exactly how formidable an opponent I can be." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm stating facts. You attempted to manipulate me into transferring my assets by claiming I was too needy. When that failed and you discovered I was more successful than you imagined, you hired investigators to build a case for having me declared incompetent. These are not the actions of concerned children. They are the actions of people who see me as an obstacle to accessing my wealth." The silence stretched between us, filled with everything neither of us was saying. "We love you, Mom," Jessica finally said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Love is not what this is," I replied. "This is greed disguised as concern, manipulation, wrapped in family obligation. When you're ready to have an honest relationship with me, one based on respect rather than asset management, you know how to reach me." I hung up and sat in the gathering dusk of my apartment, looking out at the lights beginning to twinkle across the city. My children had revealed themselves to be people I barely recognized, willing to destroy my reputation and question my sanity for the chance to control my money. But they had made a critical error in their calculations. They still saw me as the accommodating mother who had spent decades putting their needs first. They had no idea that the woman they were trying to manipulate had spent 40 years learning to fight for what was hers. Margaret Blackwood, the interior designer, had built a business empire through determination and skill. Margaret Blackwood, the investor, had outperformed the market through careful analysis and bold decisions. Margaret Blackwood, the philanthropist, had changed lives through strategic giving and personal involvement. Margaret Blackwood, the mother, had always been willing to sacrifice for her children's happiness. But Margaret Blackwood, the woman they were trying to have declared incompetent, was about to show them exactly what competence looked like. The next morning, I called Patricia with new instructions. "I want to accelerate everything," I told her. "The consolidation of assets, the public recognition, all of it. They want to see what they're really dealing with. Let's show them." "Are you sure?" Patricia asked. "Once we do this, there's no going back to being their quiet, modest mother." I thought about Jessica's threats, Robert's calculations, and David's painful but honest recognition of how they'd all misjudged me. I thought about the private investigator harassing my employees and the fake concern for my well-being that masked their greed. I stopped being their quiet, modest mother the moment they decided I was too needy to manage my own life, I said. Now they get to see who Margaret Blackwood really is. The campaign we launched over the next 2 weeks was comprehensive and devastating. Every business publication in Chicago suddenly seemed to discover the remarkable story of Margaret Blackwood, the interior designer who had quietly built one of the most successful woman-owned enterprises in the Midwest. Forbes ran a feature on my investment strategies, revealing a portfolio that had consistently outperformed major indexes for 2 decades. The Wall Street Journal covered my technology patents and their impact on the smart home industry. Cranes. Chicago Business did an in-depth profile of my real estate holdings, which had grown from a single rental property to a portfolio spanning 3 states. But the piece that got the most attention was the Chicago Tribune's Sunday feature on Anonymous, philanthropy in the city. The article revealed that Margaret Blackwood's charitable foundation had been one of the largest sources of funding for women's education and entrepreneurship programs in the region, with donations totaling over $12 million. The article included quotes from scholarship recipients, business incubator graduates, and community leaders who credited my foundation with transformative impacts on their lives and programs. For the first time, the full scope of my charitable activities became public knowledge. "Anonymous benefactor no more," read the headline, above a professional photograph of me in my office, surrounded by awards and recognition plaques I'd accumulated over the years but never displayed prominently. The response was overwhelming. Interview requests, speaking invitations, board positions, consulting opportunities. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know the woman who had been quietly excelling in multiple fields while maintaining such a low profile. My children's reaction was swift and predictable. Robert called Tuesday evening, his voice carefully controlled. "Mom, we need to talk. This media blitz, it's making the family look foolish." "How so?" "Because people are asking us about your accomplishments, and we clearly didn't know the extent of what you've been doing. It's embarrassing." I almost laughed. They were embarrassed not because they'd tried to have me declared incompetent, but because people were discovering how little they knew about their own mother's achievements. "Perhaps you should have paid more attention to my work over the years," I suggested. "That's not fair. You never told us about most of this." "I mentioned my projects constantly. You simply weren't interested enough to ask for details. But $12 million in charitable donations? Multiple businesses? Mom, this makes it look like you've been lying to us for years." "I've never lied to you about anything. I simply didn't boast about my successes because I was taught that such behavior was unseemly. Perhaps that was a mistake." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Robert alternating between accusation and attempted manipulation. He suggested that my sudden publicity campaign was evidence of the concerning behavior they'd been trying to address. He implied that my charitable activities might indicate financial irresponsibility. He even hinted that my success might not be entirely legitimate, that perhaps I'd had help I wasn't acknowledging. "Robert," I said finally, cutting off his latest attempt to paint my accomplishments as problems. "You hired a private investigator to build a case for having me declared incompetent so you could control my assets." I responded by demonstrating exactly how competent I am. "If you find the comparison embarrassing, perhaps you should reconsider your actions rather than criticizing my response." The silence that followed told me he was beginning to understand the position he'd put himself in. By trying to portray me as declining and incompetent, he'd invited public scrutiny of his claims. The media coverage of my accomplishments had effectively demolished any case they might have tried to build for guardianship. "What do you want from us?" he asked finally. "I want you to stop treating me like a problem to be managed and start treating me like the accomplished, autonomous woman I am. I want honest relationships based on mutual respect, not strategies for accessing my wealth." "And if we can't do that?" The question hung between us, heavy with implications. Robert was asking whether I would cut them off entirely if they couldn't adjust to this new reality. "Then you'll discover that having an incompetent mother who gives you money is quite different from having a competent mother who owes you nothing," I said. By the end of February, the transformation was complete. Margaret Blackwood was no longer Chicago's best-kept secret. She was a recognized force in business, philanthropy, and innovation, with a profile that had grown far beyond anything my children could have imagined. The speaking engagements began that month. The Chicago Economic Club invited me to address their annual meeting on women in business. Northwestern University asked me to speak to their entrepreneurship program. The Chicago Foundation for Women wanted me to keynote their gala. Each appearance brought new opportunities and recognition. It also brought something I hadn't expected, a social circle of peers who appreciated my accomplishments and treated me as an equal rather than a dependent. At the Economic Club luncheon, I found myself seated next to Elizabeth Chen, the CEO of a major consulting firm, and Maria Santos, who had built her family's food service business into a regional powerhouse. These were women who understood the challenges of building success while managing family expectations. "I read the Tribune piece about your foundation," Elizabeth said during the appetizer course. $12 million in anonymous donations? That's extraordinary." "I believe in investing in potential," I replied. "Too many talented women never get the chance to prove what they can do because they lack initial support." "Your children must be incredibly proud," Maria added. I smiled, but it felt forced. My children are still adjusting to seeing me as more than just their mother. Elizabeth's expression suggested she understood exactly what I meant. Family can be the most challenging audience for a successful woman. They often prefer the version of you that existed to serve their needs. The conversation continued throughout the lunch, touching on everything from investment strategies to work-life balance to the unique pressures faced by women building wealth later in life. For the first time in years, I felt like I was among people who truly understood my perspective. It was a stark contrast to my children's reaction to my newfound public profile. Jessica had started calling more frequently, but the conversations felt calculated, as if she were trying to assess how my growing prominence might affect her own social standing. Robert had begun mentioning business opportunities that might benefit from my involvement, though he framed them as favors I might do for the family, rather than investments that might benefit me. Only David seemed genuinely pleased with my success, though even he struggled with the implications. "Mom, I'm proud of you," he said during one of our increasingly regular phone calls. "But I have to admit, it's weird seeing you quoted in business magazines and invited to all these high-profile events. It's like you've become this public figure overnight." "I didn't become anything," I corrected gently. "I've always been exactly who I am. The only thing that changed is other people's awareness of it." "But why now? Why reveal everything now instead of years ago?" It was a question I'd been asked by several journalists, and one I'd been considering carefully. The simple answer was that my children's betrayal had forced my hand, but the deeper truth was more complex. Because I finally realized that hiding my success to protect other people's feelings was actually a disservice to everyone involved, I said. It taught you and your siblings to undervalue me, and it prevented me from being a role model for other women who might benefit from seeing what's possible. I never thought about it that way. Most people don't. We're taught that successful women should be modest, that achievement should be downplayed to avoid making others uncomfortable. But what message does that send to the next generation? David was quiet for a moment. That success isn't something to be proud of? Exactly. And that's not the lesson I want to leave as my legacy. The conversation marked a turning point in our relationship. David began asking more substantial questions about my work, my investments, and my future plans. He showed genuine interest in understanding the scope of my activities and the thinking behind my decisions. More importantly, he began treating me as a peer rather than a parent figure who existed primarily to support his needs. When he mentioned challenges with his consulting business, he asked for advice as one professional to another, rather than simply requesting financial assistance. Jessica and Robert, however, seemed unable to make the same adjustment. Every interaction felt strained, colored by their obvious discomfort with my public prominence and their uncertainty about how to relate to this version of their mother. The final confrontation came in early March, triggered by an article in Chicago Magazine that named me as one of the city's most influential women. The piece included details about my various business interests and a particularly flattering photograph, taken at a recent charity gala. Jessica arrived at my apartment unannounced on a Saturday morning, clearly agitated. "Mom, we need to discuss your behavior," she began without preamble. "This constant publicity, the interviews, the speaking engagements, it's becoming embarrassing for the family." I set down my coffee cup and looked at my eldest daughter, this woman who had inherited my determination, but apparently none of my wisdom about when and how to use it. Embarrassing in what way? People are asking us why we didn't know about your success, why we seemed so out of touch with our own mother's life. It makes us look either negligent or stupid. And which are you? The question caught her off guard. What? Are you negligent, having paid so little attention to my life and work that you missed decades of achievement? Or are you stupid, unable to recognize competence and success when it was right in front of you? Jessica's face flushed with anger. That's not fair. You deliberately hid things from us. I shared information about my life constantly. You simply weren't interested in anything that didn't directly impact you. But this media campaign, Mom, it's excessive. You're acting like some kind of celebrity, putting yourself in the spotlight constantly. I studied my daughter's face, seeing something I'd hoped never to see there. Resentment toward my success rather than pride in my accomplishments. "Jessica," I said quietly, "are you embarrassed by my achievements? Or are you embarrassed that you tried to have me declared incompetent just as I was being recognized as one of Chicago's most successful women?" The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica's expression shifted from anger to something approaching panic as she realized what I was suggesting. "You think this timing is coincidental?" I continued. "You spend weeks investigating my competency, hiring private detectives to build a case for guardianship, and suddenly I'm being featured in every major publication as a business innovator and philanthropist? Mom, that's not what we were doing." "That's exactly what you were doing. And now, instead of acknowledging your mistake and adjusting your behavior, you're asking me to return to the shadows to spare you embarrassment." Jessica stood up, abruptly, pacing to the windows that overlooked the lake. "This isn't about money," she said finally. "Isn't it? It's about family, about respect, about not having my mother become some kind of public figure that I have to read about in magazines to understand. Then perhaps you should have made an effort to understand me before I became a public figure." She turned back to face me. And I saw something in her expression that broke my heart. The same entitled expectation that had characterized her father's worst moments. "I want you to stop," she said. "The interviews, the speaking engagements, all of it. Go back to being our mother instead of trying to be some kind of business celebrity." No. The word hung in the air between us, simple and final. No, no. Jessica, I will not diminish myself to make you comfortable. I will not return to hiding my accomplishments to protect your image. I will not pretend to be less than I am because my success inconveniences your narrative about who I should be. Then we have a problem. Yes, I agreed. We do. The weeks following my confrontation with Jessica brought an unexpected clarity to my life. For the first time in decades, I was living authentically, without the careful modulation of my achievements that had characterized my relationships with my children. The freedom was both exhilarating and lonely. The business world, however, embraced me completely. By April, I had been invited to join the boards of 3 major corporations, all seeking my expertise in strategic development and innovation. The Chicago Business Journal named me Entrepreneur of the Year, highlighting not just my design firm, but the full scope of my investment portfolio and technological innovations. The award ceremony was held at the Palmer House, a venue I had redesigned twice over the years for different ownership groups. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of Chicago's business elite, I felt a profound sense of arrival. Not because I had suddenly become successful, but because I was finally being recognized for success I had built over decades. When I started Blackwood Interiors 45 years ago, I began my acceptance speech. I never imagined it would lead to patents, real estate ventures, or philanthropic foundations. But success, I've learned, is rarely about a single achievement. It's about consistently choosing growth over comfort, innovation over tradition, and authenticity over approval. The audience responded with enthusiasm, but I found myself thinking about the 3 empty seats I had reserved for my children. Only David had acknowledged the invitation, sending a thoughtful note explaining that he would be traveling for work, but expressing genuine pride in my recognition. Jessica and Robert had said nothing at all. The silence from 2 of my children might have devastated me a year earlier. Now it simply confirmed what I had begun to understand. Some relationships cannot survive the revelation of who you truly are. The next morning brought news that shifted everything once again. Patricia called while I was reviewing proposals for a new hotel project in Milwaukee. "Maggie, we have a situation," she said without preamble. "Robert has filed papers with the probate court." I felt my stomach drop. "What kind of papers?" "A petition for emergency guardianship. He's claiming that your recent behavior demonstrates impaired judgment and that immediate intervention is necessary to protect your assets." The betrayal was stunning even after everything that had happened. Robert was actually moving forward with legal action to have me declared incompetent, despite the mounting evidence of my success and capability. "On what grounds?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Multiple claims. Excessive spending on what he characterizes as publicity, campaigns, erratic behavior including sudden personality changes and grandiose self-promotion. And here's the kicker. He's arguing that your previous secrecy about your finances demonstrates confusion and potential exploitation by outside parties." The twisted logic was breathtaking. My modesty about my achievements was being used as evidence of incompetence, while my recent openness was being characterized as grandiose delusion. Robert had found a way to weaponize both my past discretion and my current transparency. "What's our timeline?" I asked. "The hearing is scheduled for next Friday. That gives us 6 days to prepare our defense. And Jessica? She's not listed as a co-petitioner, but she's listed as a supporting witness." So Jessica was maintaining plausible deniability while still participating in the attempt to have me declared incompetent. It was a calculated move that allowed Her to claim she was reluctantly supporting her brother's concerns rather than driving the action herself. What do we need to do? Patricia's voice took on the focused intensity I'd learned to associate with her most important cases. We need to document everything. Medical records, business performance data, testimony from colleagues and clients. We need to demonstrate not just that you're competent, but that you're exceptionally competent. The next 6 days passed in a blur of preparation. My doctor, Dr. Emily Rodriguez, conducted a comprehensive cognitive assessment that I passed with flying colors. She also provided detailed testimony about my excellent physical health and mental acuity. Business associates lined up to testify about my sharp decision-making and innovative thinking. Maria Santos from the Economic Club luncheon volunteered to speak about my professional reputation. Even clients who had worked with me decades earlier contacted Patricia to offer their support. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source, the recipients of my charitable foundation's support. Women who had received scholarships, entrepreneurs who had benefited from business incubators, community leaders whose programs I had funded. They painted a picture of someone whose judgment was not only sound, but transformational in its impact. Margaret Blackwood changed my life, testified Dr. Sarah Kim, a pediatric surgeon who had received a full scholarship from my foundation 15 years earlier. Her support allowed me to complete medical school without debt, and her mentorship helped me navigate challenges that might otherwise have derailed my career. The idea that this woman lacks judgment or competence is not just wrong, it's absurd. Robert's case, by contrast, relied heavily on innuendo and mischaracterization. His attorney painted a picture of an elderly woman whose sudden pursuit of publicity suggested declining judgment and possible manipulation by advisors seeking to exploit her wealth. They presented my charitable donations as evidence of financial irresponsibility, my business expansion as reckless overextension, and my media appearances as attention-seeking behavior inconsistent with my previous modest demeanor. Your Honor, Robert's attorney argued, Mrs. Blackwood's recent dramatic personality change and sudden need for public recognition represent a clear departure from her previous sound judgment. We ask the court to consider whether someone truly competent would seek publicity after decades of privacy. It was a clever argument that painted my authenticity as pathology and my success as evidence of decline. In a different context, with different evidence, it might have been persuasive. But they had chosen the wrong target and the wrong time. Judge Patricia Hartwell had been on the bench for over 20 years and had presided over numerous guardianship cases. She had also, as it happened, been following the recent media coverage of Chicago's business community with interest. Mr. Thompson, she addressed Robert's attorney, you're asking me to declare incompetent a woman who has built multiple successful businesses, holds valuable patents, and has been recognized by her peers as Entrepreneur of the Year. What specific evidence do you have of cognitive decline or inability to manage her affairs? Your Honor, the sudden change in behavior, the excessive media attention, the departure from her previous modest lifestyle. Are you suggesting that successful people should remain modest about their achievements? That competent individuals should avoid media recognition? The exchange continued for several more minutes, with Judge Hartwell systematically dismantling each of Robert's claims. It became clear that she found the petition not just unfounded, but potentially frivolous. When Patricia presented our evidence, the contrast was stark. Medical testimony about my excellent cognitive function, business records showing consistent profitability and growth, investment performance that had outpaced market benchmarks for 2 decades, testimony from dozens of professional associates about my sharp mind and sound judgment. Your Honor, Patricia concluded, this petition represents nothing more than an adult child's discomfort with his mother's success and independence. Rather than celebrating her achievements, Mr. Blackwood has chosen to characterize them as pathology. This is precisely the kind of case that guardianship laws are designed to prevent. the use of legal proceedings to control competent adults who make choices their families disapprove of. Judge Hartwell's ruling was swift and decisive. Petition denied. The court finds no evidence whatsoever that Mrs. Blackwood lacks the capacity to manage her person or her estate. To the contrary, the evidence demonstrates exceptional competence and sound judgment. Mr. Blackwood, your petition appears to be motivated not by concern for your mother's welfare, but by disapproval of her choices. That is not grounds for guardianship. She paused, looking directly at Robert. Furthermore, this court is troubled by what appears to be an attempt to use the legal system to intimidate and control a competent adult. Any future petitions of this nature will be scrutinized for potential abuse of process. The hearing was over in less than 3 hours. Robert's face was ashen as he conferred with his attorney near the back of the courtroom. Jessica, who had testified briefly in support of the petition, avoided my eyes entirely. As we gathered our materials, Patricia leaned over to whisper, "That was a complete victory. He can't file another petition without new evidence of incompetence, and Judge Hartwell made it clear she'll be watching for harassment." But the victory felt hollow as I watched my children exit the courtroom without a word to me. They had chosen to view me as an adversary rather than their mother, and even legal vindication couldn't repair that fundamental breach. The aftermath of the guardianship hearing brought swift and severe consequences for Robert and Jessica, though not through any action on my part. The legal proceedings had generated their own publicity, and the Chicago business community does not look kindly on adults who attempt to legally undermine their successful parents. Within 2 weeks, Robert's financial planning firm lost 3 major clients, including one who specifically cited concerns about Mr. Blackwood's judgment and character in their termination letter. Professional relationships that had taken years to build evaporated as word spread about his failed attempt to have his accomplished mother declared incompetent. Jessica's marketing firm suffered similar fallout. Several clients quietly moved their business elsewhere, apparently uncomfortable with the idea of working with someone who would publicly support claims that her mother was mentally declining, while that same mother was being celebrated as Entrepreneur of the Year. The most devastating blow came from an unexpected source: Jessica's own teenage daughter, Emily, who had followed the media coverage of my recent recognition with growing interest in her grandmother's accomplishments. Emily called me directly, something she had never done before, her voice bright with excitement about her school's upcoming career day. "Grandma Maggie, would you come speak to my class about being an entrepreneur? My friends are so impressed that my grandmother is this famous businesswoman." The conversation was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. Emily had no idea about the guardianship petition or her mother's role in trying to have me declared incompetent. To her, I was simply her accomplished grandmother, whose success she wanted to share with her classmates. "I'd be honored," I told her. "But you should check with your mother first." "Oh, she won't mind," Emily said confidently. "She's always telling us how important it is to have strong female role models." The irony was painful. Jessica, who had built her career on marketing messages about female empowerment, had spent months trying to undermine the most successful woman in her own family. When Emily called back the next day, her tone had changed completely. "Grandma, Maggie, Mom says you can't come to career day. She says you're too busy with your publicity schedule." The excuse was thin enough that even a 15-year-old could see through it, and Emily's disappointed silence told me she was beginning to understand that something was wrong between her mother and me. By June, the full scope of the damage to Jessica and Robert's professional relationships had become clear. Robert's firm was struggling financially, having lost nearly 40% of its client base. Jessica's company had survived, but was operating under a cloud of reputational damage that would take years to overcome. David, meanwhile, had distanced himself from his siblings' actions and had begun building an honest relationship with me. His consulting business was thriving, partly because several of my professional contacts had chosen to work with him after being impressed by his integrity during the family crisis. "I've been thinking about what happened," he told me during one of our regular lunch meetings. "And I realize now that Robert and Jessica never really saw you as a person separate from your role as our mother." "What do you mean?" "They couldn't accept that Margaret Blackwood, the successful businesswoman, and Margaret Blackwood, their mother, were the same person. It was like they needed you to be either one thing or the other, but not both." His insight was remarkably perceptive. My other children had indeed seemed unable to reconcile my various identities, preferring the version of me that existed primarily to support their needs. "But that's not how people work," David continued. "Everyone has multiple facets, multiple talents, multiple roles. The fact that you're our mother doesn't diminish your other achievements, and the fact that you're successful doesn't make you less of a mother." I tried to tell them that, I said. "I know." But they weren't ready to hear it. Maybe they never will be. The summer brought new opportunities and recognition. Harvard Business School invited me to teach a seminar on building wealth through diversified innovation. The Chicago Foundation for Women asked me to chair their annual fundraising campaign. 3 different publishers approached me about writing a book on female entrepreneurship. Each opportunity was exciting on its own merits, but they also represented something more significant: a life built on my own terms, free from the need to minimize my achievements to protect other people's egos. The speaking engagement at Harvard was particularly meaningful. Standing before a classroom of ambitious MBA students, I talked about the importance of authenticity in building sustainable success. "For too many years," I told them, "I allowed family dynamics to shape how I presented my accomplishments to the world. I thought I was being modest, but I was actually being dishonest. When you minimize your achievements to make others comfortable, you teach them to devalue what you've built." A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "But what if being honest about your success damages relationships that matter to you?" It was the question I'd been grappling with for months. Then you have to decide whether those relationships were built on genuine foundation or whether they required you to be less than you are to maintain them. The conversation continued for another hour, with students sharing their own experiences of navigating family expectations and professional ambitions. Their questions forced me to articulate insights I was still developing about the cost of authenticity and the price of approval. In September, Chicago Magazine featured me on their cover with the headline, "The Grandmother Who Became a Business Icon." The article traced my journey from quiet success to public recognition, including a detailed account of the guardianship proceedings that had backfired so spectacularly on Robert. The piece also included my first public comments about my children's behavior. "I spent decades believing that good mothers put their children's comfort ahead of their own authenticity," I was quoted as saying. "I've learned that this actually serves no one well. Children benefit from seeing their parents as complete, accomplished human beings, not just as sources of support and resources." The article generated significant response, with dozens of women reaching out to share their own stories of family relationships complicated by late-in-life success or recognition. Many had faced similar pressure to minimize their achievements to preserve family harmony. One letter particularly moved me. It came from Dr. Susan Walsh, a retired biochemist whose children had reacted poorly when she received a prestigious scientific award at age 72. "Reading your story felt like looking in a mirror," she wrote. "My children couldn't understand why their mother suddenly needed public recognition for work she'd been doing quietly for decades. They saw my acceptance of the award as vanity rather than long overdue acknowledgement of important research. Like you, I had to choose between their approval and my own integrity." Dr. Walsh's letter arrived just as I was preparing for the Chicago Foundation for Women Gala, where I would be presenting awards to emerging female entrepreneurs. Reading her words reminded me that my story wasn't just personal, it was part of a larger pattern of how families sometimes struggle to accept the full complexity of the women in their lives. The gala itself was a remarkable event. 500 of Chicago's most successful women gathered to celebrate achievement and support the next generation of female leaders. As I presented awards to 3 young entrepreneurs whose businesses my foundation had helped fund, I felt a profound sense of continuity and purpose. Success is not just about what you achieve, I told the audience during my remarks. It's about what you enable others to achieve. But enabling others should never require diminishing yourself. After the event, as I was preparing to leave, Emily appeared beside me in the hotel lobby. My granddaughter had grown taller in the month since we'd spoken, and there was something more mature in her expression as she approached. "Grandma Maggie, can we talk?" We found a quiet corner of the lobby, away from the lingering crowd of gala attendees. Emily looked nervous but determined. "I know what happened," she said without preamble. "About the court thing, about Mom and Uncle Robert trying to say you weren't capable of handling your own life." I wasn't sure how to respond. Emily was only 15, but she was clearly grappling with complex family dynamics that most adults would find challenging. "How do you know about that?" I looked it up online. There were articles about the court hearing, about the guardianship petition. I couldn't understand why Mom wouldn't let you come to career day, so I kept researching until I figured it out. The maturity in her voice reminded me of myself at that age, trying to understand adult complications that didn't make sense from a child's perspective. "What do you think about what you learned?" Emily was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I think Mom and Uncle Robert were wrong. I think they were scared that you were more successful than they realized, and instead of being proud, they tried to make it seem like you were the problem." Her insight was remarkably sophisticated for someone so young. That's a very mature way to look at it. "I want you to know that I'm proud of you," Emily said, her voice gaining confidence. "All my friends think it's amazing that my grandmother is this successful businesswoman who's changing people's lives with her foundation. I don't understand why Mom can't see that." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Emily asking thoughtful questions about my work, my goals, and my plans for the future. She seemed genuinely interested in understanding who I was beyond my role as her grandmother. As we prepared to part ways, Emily hesitated, then asked the question I'd been dreading. "Are you going to stop being part of our family because of what Mom and Uncle Robert did?" The question cut straight to the heart of my dilemma. How do you maintain relationships with people who fundamentally refuse to accept who you are? "I will always love you and your cousins," I told her. "And I will always love your mother and uncle, even when I don't like their choices. But I can't go back to pretending to be less than I am to make them comfortable." Emily nodded solemnly. "That makes sense. I just hope someday Mom realizes what she's missing." As the year drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary transformation my life had undergone. 12 months earlier, I had been a successful but private woman whose own children saw her as becoming too needy. Now, I was a recognized business leader, philanthropist, and public figure whose story had inspired hundreds of other women to embrace their own achievements. The personal cost had been significant. My relationships with Jessica and Robert remained severely strained, with only minimal contact around holidays and family obligations. They treated me with polite distance, like acquaintances whose company they tolerated rather than family members they cherished. But unexpected compensations had emerged. David and I had developed a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared professional interests. Emily and I maintained regular contact, with my granddaughter often seeking advice about school, career planning, and navigating family expectations. Most surprisingly, I had built a community of peers who valued my insights and sought my counsel, on both professional and personal matters. For the first time in my adult life, I was surrounded by people who saw me as a complete person rather than just a source of support. The final vindication came in December, when the Chicago Business Council announced their selection for Lifetime Achievement Award. The honor, given annually to a business leader whose career exemplified innovation, integrity, and community impact, had never before been awarded to someone primarily known for interior design. Margaret Blackwood represents the best of Chicago's entrepreneurial spirit, the council president announced at the award ceremony. She has built success across multiple industries while maintaining a commitment to supporting others that has transformed countless lives. Standing at the podium in the ballroom of the Four Seasons, looking out at an audience that included some of Chicago's most influential leaders, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not because my career was ending, but because I was finally being recognized for the full scope of what I had built. When I started my business 45 years ago, I began my acceptance speech. Success meant building something sustainable that could support my family. As the years passed, success evolved to mean building something meaningful that could support my community. Tonight, I understand that true success means building something authentic that reflects who you really are, regardless of whether others are comfortable with that truth. I paused, scanning the audience until I found David. In the third row, beaming with pride, Emily sat beside him, having convinced her parents to let her attend. Jessica and Robert were nowhere to be seen. Some of you know that this year has been personally challenging, I continued. I've learned that authenticity sometimes requires difficult choices about which relationships can survive your refusal to diminish yourself. But I've also learned that living as your complete, accomplished self opens doors to connections and opportunities you never imagined possible. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. After the ceremony, I was surrounded by well-wishers, interview requests, and invitations to speak at other events. But the moment that mattered most came when Emily appeared at my side as the crowd began to thin. "Grandma Maggie," she said, her eyes bright with excitement, "I want to be just like you when I grow up. Not just successful, but brave enough to be myself no matter what anyone else thinks." Looking into my granddaughter's face, I realized that my struggle with Jessica and Robert had achieved something I never expected. Instead of preserving family harmony by minimizing my achievements, my refusal to be diminished had become a model for the next generation of what was possible when women refused to apologize for their success. Margaret Blackwood, the woman my children had dismissed as too needy, had become Margaret Blackwood, the matriarch who showed her granddaughter that neediness and independence weren't opposites, but that true strength meant being complete enough to both achieve greatly and love deeply, without sacrificing either for the comfort of others. As I left the Four Seasons that night, my Lifetime Achievement Award in hand, and my granddaughter's words echoing in my mind, I understood that the greatest transfer of assets hadn't been the money Jessica and Robert had tried to claim, but the legacy of authenticity and courage I was passing to Emily and the countless other women whose lives my story might touch. The woman who had been told she was becoming too needy had instead become exactly who she was meant to be, someone powerful enough to transform not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her who was ready to embrace the fullness of what women could achieve when they refused to make themselves smaller for anyone else's comfort. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.